Paul lived on the edge of a human colony world, a place far from Earth where the land stretched wide with rocks, dust, and sharp winds. Life here was not easy. People built their homes with metal walls and used machines to pull water from the ground. Paul worked as a supply runner, carrying goods between the colony and the outposts spread across the wastelands. He did not think of himself as a hero, only as someone who worked hard to survive. On one clear morning, Paul set out on his old ground vehicle. The sun glowed pale behind thin clouds and the land stretched endless before him. He expected nothing unusual, but as he drove across a narrow pass between two cliffs, a strange flash caught his eye. It was not the reflection of sun on rock. It was something else, something broken and burning. Paul slowed the vehicle and moved closer. The smoke carried the smell of scorched metal. He soon saw the wreckage of a small craft smashed into the rocks. The design was not human. The curves were smooth, the markings bright and strange. His heart raced. He had seen alien ships in the sky before, but never this close. He parked his vehicle at a safe distance and climbed down. The wreck hissed with sparks and the air was thick with heat. At first, Paul thought no one could have survived such a crash. Then he heard it, a weak sound, almost like a cry. He froze, listening carefully. Yes, it came again. A voice, soft and pained, from inside the wreck. Paul pushed aside sharp metal pieces and leaned into the broken cabin. There, lying on the floor, was a figure. It was a girl, but not human. Her skin was pale silver with faint blue patterns that shimmered in the dim light. Her hair fell like strands of soft crystal, glowing faintly as she moved. Her eyes, half open, showed fear and pain. She was young, perhaps close to his own age. Paul's first thought was to step back. He had heard warnings. The aliens did not want humans interfering with their people. If the colony guards found out he had touched her, they might blame him. But when he saw the blood-like liquid flowing from her arm and the way she struggled to breathe, he could not turn away. "You're alive," Paul whispered, though he knew she might not understand. "Hold on, I'll help you." The alien girl's lips moved, but her voice was weak, broken. Still, her eyes locked onto his, and he could see the same truth he had seen in injured humans before. The simple plea to live. Paul made his choice. He lifted her carefully into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile, as if her body was not built for the heavy pull of this world's gravity. He carried her back to his vehicle, laying her gently on the seat. The drive back to his shelter was tense. Paul kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting patrol drones to appear. If anyone saw him, they would ask questions he could not answer. But the girl's breathing was shallow, and he had no time to waste. When he reached his shelter, a small cabin made of metal sheets, he carried her inside. He laid her on his bed and searched for supplies. He had no alien medicine, only the first aid kit humans used. Still, he tried. He cleaned her wounds with water, wrapped her arm with cloth, and checked her breathing. The girl stirred. Her eyes opened wider this time. She looked around the room, then back at him. She seemed confused, perhaps frightened, but she did not push him away. "It's all right," Paul said softly. "You're safe here." For a moment there was silence. Then the girl spoke a word, strange and flowing. Paul shook his head. "I don't understand," he admitted. He pointed at her arm and said slowly, "Better, safe." Her eyes followed his hand. Then she gave a small nod. She tried to speak again, but her voice broke into a cough. Paul gave her a drink of water, and she took it with shaky hands. As hours passed, the girl grew more stable. She lay still but watched him with careful eyes. Paul noticed she was trying to study his face, his movements, as if to learn who he was. Night fell outside. Paul lit a small lamp and sat across from her. He thought about what he had done. If the colony guards learned about this, he could be punished. If her people came, they might see him as an enemy. Yet when he looked at her, he felt no regret. He knew he could not have left her in the wreck. The next day, Paul woke to find her sitting up weakly. She touched the cloth around her arm and then looked at him. With slow effort, she spoke in broken human words. "You save." Paul blinked in surprise. She could speak, even if only a little. "Yes," he said with a nod. "I saved you." She placed her hand on her chest. "Rena," she said softly. Paul understood. Her name, Rena. He repeated, pointing to her, then placed a hand on his own chest. "Paul." Her lips curved faintly, almost a smile. From that moment, a fragile bond began. Paul gave her food, simple bread and dried fruit. She ate carefully. Unfamiliar with the taste, but she accepted it. She watched as he worked around the shelter, repairing tools, fixing water pipes, and she seemed curious about everything he did. Sometimes she would point to objects and say a word in her own language. Paul would answer with the human word. Slowly, they began to share small pieces of understanding. But outside, danger grew. Paul heard the low hum of patrol crafts in the sky. He knew they were searching for the crash. If they found Rena here, it could end badly for both of them. He thought of sending her away, but she was still too weak to walk far. One evening, as the sound of engines echoed across the sky, Paul looked at her and said, "We have to be careful." He pointed up to the sky, then to his ear, making the sound of the patrol craft. "Danger," Rena understood. Her eyes darkened and she gave a slow nod. She spoke a word in her own tongue, then touched his hand. Though he did not know the meaning, he felt she was thanking him. For days, Paul kept her hidden. He taught her simple human words, and she taught him some of hers. They shared food and quiet moments. She asked questions with her eyes, and he answered with gestures and patience. Each day, her strength returned a little more. Still, Paul could not shake the worry. He had crossed a line by saving her, and he did not know what would happen when her people arrived. But when he looked at Rena, he knew one thing clearly: he had done the right thing. The days passed slowly inside Paul's small shelter, and each day the alien girl, Rena, grew a little stronger. Her wounds closed under the cloth he had wrapped, and the strange blue patterns across her skin seemed brighter now, glowing softly in the dim light of the lamp. She could sit up on her own, drink water without his help, and even walk a few steps before her legs gave out. Paul tried not to think too far ahead, but he knew time was running short. The patrol craft still flew above the wasteland, searching. Sometimes at night he could hear distant engines or see faint flashes in the sky like signals. Her people would come for her soon. What would they say when they found her with a human? He did not know, and the thought weighed heavy on him. Still, in the quiet of the shelter, something else began to grow. It started with simple words, clumsy but real. "Bread," Paul said one morning, holding out a small piece of the dry loaf. Rena repeated carefully, "Brie," and he smiled. "Good." She tilted her head, the silver strands of her hair falling across her shoulder. Then she pointed at herself and said a word in her own language. It was soft, rising like music. Paul frowned, trying to repeat it. "Shalin?" Rena laughed, a light sound, though she quickly covered her mouth as if embarrassed. She repeated the word more slowly. Paul tried again, and this time he was closer. Rena nodded in approval, her eyes shining. From then on, they began trading words each day. Paul would point at the water jar, the chair, the lamp, and say the human word. Rena would repeat it. Then she would point to the same object and say the alien word, waiting for him to copy her. Sometimes he failed, making her laugh. Sometimes he got it right and she gave a proud nod. The bond was not just in words. It was in the small actions they shared. Paul showed her how to heat food on the small stove, how to tie knots in rope, how to fix a loose bolt on the water pump. She, in return, showed him strange little tricks with her thin device she had kept from the crash. It was broken in many ways, but she pressed symbols and caused small lights to glow, or used it to scan her own wounds and adjust the cloth with more skill than Paul ever had. One afternoon, as the sun burned bright outside, Paul heard a weak hum coming from her device. Rena sat near the lamp, pressing the screen with careful hands. A pale light formed above it, showing shapes in the air. Shapes of her world, perhaps, or of her people. Paul stared in wonder. It was like a small floating picture, glowing and moving slowly. Rena noticed his wide eyes. She looked at the light, then back at him. Slowly she said, "Home." Paul repeated, "Home." She nodded. Then pointing at him, she asked in broken words, "You, home?" He hesitated, then looked around the small metal shelter. "Yes, my home." His voice was quiet, almost unsure, because even to him the word felt heavy. This place was not truly a home, just walls and roof against the wind. But Rena gave a gentle nod, as if she understood. That night, as the lamp flickered, Rena surprised him by asking another question. "Why a save?" Paul looked at her, caught off guard. "Why did I save you?" She nodded. He leaned back, thinking. The answer seemed simple to him, but how could he explain? "Because you needed help," he said slowly. "Because it was right." Rena tilted her head, her eyes studying him. Her people had told her humans were selfish, that they cared only for trade, for power, for themselves. But here was this man, living alone in a shelter, who had risked trouble to save her. She could see no reward he had gained, no reason but kindness. She whispered a word in her own tongue, soft like a promise. Paul did not understand, but the way she said it made his chest feel warm. Days turned to a week. Rena's steps grew steadier. Sometimes Paul would walk with her outside the shelter, letting her feel the wind and see the wide land. She was still weak, but she would stand tall, gazing far across the horizon with eyes that shone in the sunlight. One evening they climbed a short ridge near the shelter. The sky stretched wide, painted in red and gold. Rena looked at the sun setting and spoke softly. Beautiful. Paul glanced at her, surprised. That was a human word, spoken clear. She caught his look and smiled, repeating, beautiful. He chuckled. Yes, beautiful. For a moment they stood side by side in silence, two strangers from different worlds sharing the same view. But peace never lasted long in the wastelands. That night the sound of patrol crafts came closer than before. Paul rushed outside to see faint lights moving across the horizon. They were searching and they were close. He hurried back in. Rena saw his face and knew. Danger, she whispered, using the human word he had taught her. Paul nodded. He quickly moved to hide signs of her presence, covering the bed with a blanket, moving her device under a metal panel in the floor. Rena helped as best as she could, though her hands trembled. The patrols passed after hours of tense waiting, their lights sweeping the land but not reaching the shelter. Still, Paul knew it was only a matter of time before they came again. The next morning, Paul sat at the small table, his face heavy with worry. They will find you, he said. I cannot keep you safe here forever. Rena looked at him. For the first time, her voice was firm. Paul, safe. You safe, he blinked. She was not speaking only of herself. She was speaking of him too. In that moment, Paul realized something had changed. It was not just that he had saved her. She now cared for him as well in her own way. The bond between them was not one-sided. That day, she tried harder to learn his words. She asked about his life, about Earth, about the colony. Paul told her of the old stories his father once shared, about blue oceans and green forests. She listened with wide eyes as if he were describing a dream. When Paul grew tired, she told him short things in her own language, pointing to the stars, to the earth, to herself. He could not always understand, but he listened, and sometimes she would laugh when he repeated a word poorly, covering her mouth with her hand. For Paul, who had lived alone for years, these moments were strange but comforting. For Rena, who had been raised with distance from humans, these moments were new and powerful. The bond deepened not because they spoke the same tongue, but because they shared the same silence, the same small kindnesses. On the seventh night, when the wind howled outside, Rena looked at him and whispered clearly, "Friend." Paul turned to her, eyes wide. She repeated with a soft smile, "Friend." He felt a weight lift inside his chest. He smiled back, saying, "Yes, friend." At that moment, the fear of patrols, the rules of their people, all seemed far away. They were just two beings who had found trust in a place where trust was rare. Yet both of them knew deep inside, the world outside would not stay silent for long. The bond between Paul and Rena grew stronger each day, but the outside world did not remain silent. The sky above the wastelands carried louder sounds now. The hum of patrol ships came more often, and sometimes sharp beams of light swept across the ground at night. Paul knew the search was reaching its end. One morning, Rena woke before Paul. She stood near the window, looking at the horizon. Her silver hair glowed faintly as the first light touched it. She whispered a word in her own language, soft but full of meaning. Paul stirred and saw her face. It was calm, but her eyes held something heavy. Acceptance, perhaps. "They are close," Paul said, his voice rough with worry. Rena nodded. Close. She had learned enough human words now to make herself understood. Each word was careful, but it carried strength. Paul walked over and stood beside her. "When they come, what will they do to you?" he asked quietly. Rena hesitated. "Take home, safe." Then her eyes lowered. "You, not safe." Her words struck him like a stone. He knew she was right. To her people, he was a human who had broken their rules, who had touched what was not his to touch. Even if he had saved her life, they might see him as a threat. Still, Paul tried to smile. "I will be fine," he said. But his own voice lacked belief. The next day, the sound of engines roared closer than ever. Dust rose in the distance. Paul climbed a ridge and saw shapes in the sky, sleek alien ships larger than patrol crafts descending toward the crash site. His heart sank. They had found the place. Soon they would trace the ground, and his shelter was not far. He returned quickly. Rena was waiting, her crystal-like hair glowing in the dim room. She looked at him, and both of them knew the moment had come. "Your people," Paul said. Rena gave a small nod. Her hands trembled slightly, but her face held quiet resolve. Paul's chest tightened. He had imagined this moment many times, but now it was real. Soon she would leave, and he would return to his lonely life. Only this time it would feel emptier than before. Before he could say more, the roar of engines filled the air. Shadows passed across the shelter as ships flew overhead. A bright light swept across the land, then fixed on the shelter itself. Paul froze. "They found us," he whispered. Moments later, a group of alien figures landed outside. Their armor glowed with strange energy, and their weapons shone like sharp beams. Their leader stepped forward, tall and proud, with markings across his armor that showed rank. The door to the shelter slid open with a hiss. Paul shielded his eyes from the sudden light. The aliens stepped inside, their faces stern. Rena gasped softly, then moved forward. "Stop," she said in her own language. Her voice carried pain but also strength. She stood between Paul and the armed figures. The alien leader's eyes narrowed. He spoke quickly in their tongue, and Paul could not understand. But he saw the sharp glance directed at him, filled with suspicion. Rena replied firmly, her words flowing like music. She gestured to her arm, showing the bandages, then to Paul. Her tone carried force, as if she was explaining something important. The leader frowned. He turned to Paul and spoke a short phrase, his voice cold. Paul said nothing, not knowing what was asked. Rena quickly added, "He saved me alive." Because him, the leader's gaze hardened. He looked at Paul with doubt, as if he did not believe. To him, a human's act of kindness seemed impossible. Perhaps he thought Paul had kept Rena for some hidden reason. Paul raised his hand slowly, trying to show he meant no harm. "I only helped her," he said. His voice was steady, though his heart pounded. "She was hurt. I could not leave her," Rena translated his words. Her voice carried warmth when she spoke his name. The aliens exchanged uneasy glances. Some lowered their weapons slightly, but the leader still looked doubtful. He stepped closer to Paul, his eyes sharp. Then he spoke in broken human words, rough but clear enough. "Why?" Paul looked at him straight. "Because it was right." The leader's expression did not change. He turned to Rena, speaking again in their language. Rena's reply was strong, almost defiant. Her voice rose, echoing in the small room. Paul could not understand her words, but he could feel her meaning. She was standing for him. The leader finally gave a sharp command. Two aliens moved forward and gently supported Rena. She resisted at first, then looked back at Paul. Her silver eyes glimmered with something unspoken. Paul's throat felt tight. "You will be safe now," he said softly. "That's all I wanted," Rena whispered. "Paul, friend." Her voice shook as they guided her outside. He followed them to the doorway. The alien ships waited, glowing under the sky. The leader paused and gave Paul one last look, stern and unreadable. Then he turned away. Rena was led aboard the ship. Before the doors closed, she looked back once more. Their eyes met. She lifted her hand slightly, weak but steady. Paul raised his in return. Then the door sealed shut and the ship lifted into the sky. Dust swirled as the ships rose higher and higher until they vanished into the clouds. Silence fell across the wasteland once more. Paul stood alone outside his shelter, staring at the empty sky. His chest felt hollow. He told himself this was how it had to be. She was safe now, with her people. That was what mattered. But deep inside, he knew life would never feel the same again. That night, the shelter felt colder. The small lamp gave its usual light, but the room seemed emptier without Rena sitting nearby, pointing at objects and asking their names. Paul sat at the table, staring at the piece of cloth she had once held, and his heart ached. He did not know if he would ever see her again. He only knew that for a short time they had shared something real, trust between two beings who should have been strangers, and though her people had taken her back, he could not forget the way she had stood in front of him, speaking for him, defending him when no one else would. It was not the end of the story. Deep in his heart, Paul felt it was only the beginning. Rena's return to her people was not what she had expected. The ship descended quietly onto the landing platform of her city, its metallic surface reflecting the pale sunlight. As she stepped out, she saw her people waiting, faces serious, eyes cold with suspicion. Paul's actions had already reached them, and they did not trust what had happened. The commander of her people, a tall figure with bright markings across the armor, approached her first. His gaze was sharp, assessing every detail of her form, the bandages on her arm, the faint glow of her skin, and the dust on her clothes. All told the story of what had occurred away from their supervision. "Rena," the commander said firmly, "you were not to leave the crash site. Why did you go to a human?" Rena's hands clenched slightly. She had rehearsed no words for this moment. Her people had taught her obedience, but she had learned something entirely different from Paul: courage, compassion, and the strength to act for what was right. I went because he saved me," Rena replied quietly, her voice steady. The words sounded small, but in the silence of the landing platform they carried weight. The commander's eyes narrowed. "A human? You trusted a human?" Rena met his gaze without fear. "He did not want anything in return. He only wanted to help me. That is why I trusted him." Murmurs ran through the gathered crowd. Many whispered among themselves, surprised and confused. Their customs had always warned against trusting humans, painting them as dangerous and unwise. And now, one of their own had openly chosen a human over the caution they had been taught. "You disobeyed direct orders," the commander said, his voice rising. "This is serious. You put yourself and our people at risk." Rena held her ground. "I was in danger. I had no one else to help me. He saved my life. That is not wrong." A young member of the assembly, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. "She speaks the truth," he said. "If humans are capable of such acts, perhaps we have judged them too quickly." The commander's glare shifted to the young member. "You question tradition?" he demanded. "I question only what I have seen," the young member said, his voice firm. "We do not know humans well. Perhaps there is more to them than we thought." Rena felt a spark of hope. Her words had stirred something in her people. Even small, it was a start. Later, in the privacy of her chamber, Rena reflected on her time with Paul. She touched the bandages on her arm, remembering how carefully he had treated her wounds. She remembered the quiet moments in his shelter, the shared laughter, the small lessons, and the trust that had grown between them. Her people knocked and entered. Two figures, senior members of the council, stepped in. "Rena," one said, "we understand you have feelings for this human's actions, but you must understand our ways. Humans are not to be trusted." "I understand your ways," Rena replied, "but I have learned something else. Humans are capable of great courage and kindness. I saw it with my own eyes. Why should we ignore that?" The council members exchanged uneasy looks. Rena knew she was taking a risk by speaking so openly, yet something inside her would not let her stay silent. The following days were tense. Rena's people expected her to resume her duties, to forget her time with Paul and return to obedience. But she could not. She thought of him constantly, of his calm eyes and the steady way he had cared for her. She remembered the words he had spoken, the lessons he had quietly shared. One evening, she slipped out of her quarters, moving silently through the halls of her city. She carried a small device Paul had shown her, broken and old yet familiar. It was a symbol of the bond they had formed, a reminder that the world was larger and more complex than her people's rules suggested. She reached the edge of the city and looked out over the wastelands. The land stretched endlessly, the place where Paul had lived alone. She felt a pull in her chest, a longing to return, even if just for a moment, to the one who had shown her a different kind of strength. Her decision was clear. She would not stay silent. She would act even if it meant defying her people. The next morning, she addressed the council during a formal gathering. Every eye turned to her as she stepped forward. Her silver hair shone faintly in the soft light, and her voice carried clearly. "I will speak," she said. "I will speak of what I have seen and learned. I was saved by a human. He acted with courage and kindness. He did not seek power or reward. He saved me because it was the right thing to do." A wave of murmurs spread through the assembly. Some members frowned, some exchanged nervous glances, and a few looked intrigued. The commander's face hardened. "You openly defy us," he said. "You challenge our teachings. How can we allow this?" Rena held her head high.
I am not defying to rebel.
I am defying to show that we must see the world as it is, not only as we have been told. Humans are capable of good. We cannot ignore that. I cannot ignore it. The commander's gaze fell on her, sharp and assessing. You risk much by speaking this way, he said slowly. Your actions could bring shame to your family and danger to our people. I accept that risk, Rena said firmly, because it is right. Because courage and kindness are stronger than fear. Her words resonated in the room. The council was silent for long moments, unsure how to respond. Many had never heard such direct speech from one so young, especially from someone who had always followed the rules. Later, in her quarters, Rena prepared a small signal device. She needed to contact Paul. It was risky. Her people would notice if she used it, but she could not stay silent. She wanted him to know she was safe and that she would not forget what he had done for her. She activated the device. A small light blinked softly. She whispered Paul's name, hoping somehow he could receive her signal. Meanwhile, in his shelter far across the wastelands, Paul felt a flicker in the air. The device he had once repaired showed a soft light. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be her? He leaned closer, careful not to make sudden movements. A message was faint but clear, a signal from Rena. She was alive, she had not forgotten, and she had taken a stand. Paul's chest swelled with pride and relief. He knew her actions were bold. She had risked much, but she had done it because she believed in what was right. Back in her city, Rena faced the consequences. Many members of her people questioned her choices. Some wanted to punish her, to remind her of the rules she had broken. Yet slowly the words she spoke and the courage she showed began to plant new thoughts in their minds. Perhaps humans were not merely threats. Perhaps there was more to learn. Rena felt a mixture of fear and hope. She knew her people would not change overnight, but she also knew she had ignited a spark. One small spark could grow. One small act of courage could shift the hearts of many. She returned to her quarters that evening and touched her arm where Paul had once wrapped her wounds. She whispered softly, "Thank you, friend." Her people could not hear her words, but she did not care. They were for herself and for the human who had changed her life. Outside, the city lights glimmered, but beyond them, the wastelands stretched wide and empty. She imagined Paul walking there, alone but steadfast. She imagined their small shelter, the shared laughter, the quiet lessons, and the trust that had formed between two beings from different worlds. Rena knew that the bond they shared was stronger than distance, stronger than fear. She would not forget. And even if her people resisted her words, she would continue to speak, continue to act, and continue to show the value of courage and kindness. That night, Rena looked out at the stars, her silver hair glowing faintly in the pale light. She whispered once more, "Friend, always?" Rena's bold words had begun to stir her people, though not everyone accepted them. Some elders shook their heads in disbelief, while younger members whispered in agreement. She had risked much to speak the truth about Paul, but deep inside, she knew it was worth it. Courage was contagious, and she could feel a subtle change in her people's hearts. Days passed, and Rena continued to stand firm. She attended the daily rituals and lessons expected of her, but she also spent time quietly speaking with those who would listen. She told stories of the human who had saved her life, of his small acts of kindness and of the trust they had shared. Her voice was calm but unwavering, and slowly, more people began to question what they had always been told about humans. Meanwhile, Paul continued his life in the wastelands. He returned to his shelter, fixing broken tools, tending the small garden outside, and repairing the small vehicle he used to travel between posts. Yet his thoughts were never far from Rena. The signal she had sent him had given him hope, and he felt the bond between them growing stronger, even across the distance. One evening, as Paul worked on the vehicle, he noticed faint lights in the sky. They moved differently than patrols or supply ships. His heart raced. Could it be her? He climbed a small ridge for a better view. The lights grew brighter, and he could make out the shape of a small craft descending toward him. Rena had returned. She had acted boldly, defying her people once more to see him. The craft landed softly nearby, and she stepped out, her silver hair glowing faintly in the moonlight. Her eyes shone with determination. Paul ran to her, relief and joy flooding through him. "Rena," he called. She smiled, though her expression was serious. "I could not wait," she said simply. "I needed to see you, to tell you thank you, to show you that I remember." He took her hands in his. They were small and warm, a reminder of the fragile but powerful bond they had formed. "I never forgot you," Paul said. "I always hoped you were safe." Rena nodded. "I am, and I have learned much. About courage, about kindness, about humans." For a long moment they stood together, two beings from different worlds, connected by trust and friendship. Yet Rena's people were not far behind. The commander and several others had followed her, suspicious of her actions. They arrived to find her with Paul, alive and unharmed. Their expressions were a mixture of anger, confusion, and disbelief. "You returned to the human?" the commander demanded, his voice sharp. Rena faced him unflinching. "Yes," she said, "because it was right, because I wanted to." The commander's eyes narrowed. He had expected fear, hesitation, or obedience. Instead, he saw courage. He saw a young alien willing to act for what she believed was good. Paul stepped forward, keeping his hands visible. "I do not mean any harm," he said. "I only helped her when she needed it. That is all." The commander studied him carefully. He noticed the calm in Paul's eyes, the steady voice, and the lack of any hidden motive. Slowly, his posture softened. He spoke in his own language, but Rena translated. "She tells the truth," Rena said. "He saved me. He did not lie. He acted with courage. We both acted as we believed was right." The commander paused. He looked at Paul again, then at Rena. Something shifted in his expression. Perhaps it was understanding. Perhaps it was respect. He nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "Perhaps we have judged humans too quickly. We will consider your words." Rena felt a rush of relief. She had not only defended Paul, but she had also opened a small door for her people to see humans in a new light. One step at a time, change was possible. Over the next days, discussions spread throughout her people. Elders debated the value of courage, the meaning of kindness, and the possibility that humans were not enemies, but potential allies. Young members listened eagerly, inspired by Rena's example. Rena spent time with Paul as well. She returned to the wastelands where they could meet freely, away from the pressures of her people. Together, they shared stories, taught each other new words, and laughed at the small misunderstandings between their worlds. One afternoon, as they walked across the rocky hills, Rena turned to Paul. "You taught me something," she said softly. "More than words, more than healing. You taught me courage. You taught me kindness. That is more than any lesson I could have learned at home." Paul smiled. "And you taught me something too," he replied. "That trust and friendship can cross worlds, that we are stronger when we care for others." They paused on a ridge, looking out over the wastelands. The sun was low, casting golden light across the rocks. For a moment, the universe felt wide and full of possibilities. "I want to go back to my people," Rena said finally. "But now, I want to go back differently. I want to show them what I have learned. I want to help them see the world as it is, not only as they have been told." Paul nodded. "And I will help you," he said. "From here, from the outside, or however you need. You are not alone." Together, they made plans. Rena would speak, act, and demonstrate courage to her people. Paul would provide guidance and support, helping her navigate the challenges she would face. The bond between them had grown beyond simple friendship. It was now a partnership, a shared mission to show the value of trust, kindness, and courage. Over time, Rena's people began to change. Slowly, they started questioning old rules, exploring alliances with humans, and considering new ways of thinking. It was not easy, and not everyone agreed at first. But the seed had been planted, and with courage and patience it began to grow. Rena returned often to the wastelands to meet Paul. Each time their trust and understanding deepened, They shared laughter, stories, and quiet moments under the stars. And each time, Rena carried the lessons she had learned back to her people. The commander, once stern and unyielding, began to show signs of respect for the human. He observed Paul's honesty, patience, and quiet courage. Slowly, he acknowledged that perhaps Rena had been right. Humans were not to be feared blindly. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the horizon, Rena and Paul sat together on a ridge. The air was cool, the sky painted with colors that neither had seen before. "Do you think it will work?" Rena asked. Paul looked at her. "It will," he said. "Because you are brave, because you are honest, because you care. Courage and kindness have power." Rena smiled, leaning slightly on his shoulder. "Then we will keep trying," she said. "Yes," Paul agreed. "We will keep trying." In that quiet moment, two worlds felt closer than ever before. Through courage, through trust, and through the simple choice to help one another, they had begun to change the course of the future. The story of one human saving one alien girl had grown into something larger, an example that kindness and courage could bridge the gap between worlds, that trust could flourish even where fear had ruled for generations. And as the stars began to glow above them, Rena and Paul knew this was only the beginning. Together, they had shown that a single act of bravery, a single choice to help, could ripple far beyond what anyone expected.